So we're going to look at a few of the maintenance and service points now on the CONVIO Cutterbar. So maybe some of these areas are the things we need to be checking either daily or as the harvest goes on. Now the first thing we can see around the back of the CONVIO Cutterbar is that of the main transfer gearbox, so the box which is taking power from the combine to drive that of our drive shafts on both the Cutterbar knife and the main drive auger itself. You can see this main gearbox located here. On this gearbox we need to make sure that our lubrication is in point, so we can see that via the side glass on the machine as well. So making sure that we've got oil visible in the side glass at all times. We then also have the main hydraulic tank of the machine as well, and we can see this via the tank, the fill point at the top, and also the sight glass on the side. We need to check these oil levels again daily to make sure we've got enough hydraulic oil available to us at all times. To do so, we need to put the Cutterbar down onto a level surface, making sure the Cutterbar is nice and level so we're getting a correct reading. And we can then see through the sight glass how much oil we've got left in our tank and roughly where the min and max points are. So making sure we're keeping our oil level in between those points. If we do need to top up the tank, we've obviously got a top up point at the top here too. Just as a side point, we also need to be making sure that we're not getting any damage on any of our pipes, especially if we're potentially running the likes of our Cutterbar closer to the ground. So again, it is nice and protected behind the Cutterbar. That is the design process of it. It's nice tucked up and out of the way. However, just as a daily visual check, just making sure we haven't got any pipes that are potentially split or anything like that. On the side as well, you can also see then the main hydraulic motor drives for that of the side belts and for that of the main belt too. We can also then see the main drive shafts of the machine too. So the main drive shaft that we're connecting up to our feeder house when we first attach the Cutterbar itself. These points obviously need to be lubricated. We need to make sure that we're hitting the greasing intervals on both of the yokes on both ends of that of the drive shaft too. And again, as a nice little tip, if you do find the drive shaft is maybe a little bit stiff and hard to put onto the front of the feeder house, make sure you've lubricated that of the main shub staff on the feeder house too. Again, service intervals on these shafts are either daily or a daily check. However, some of the yokes inside are up to 250 hours. So always relate back to your service book or your service manual to make sure you're getting those daily checks in. As a secondary point, you can also see the location for the main instruction manual or the service manual down here at the bottom. There is a little black holder at the bottom just for us safely keeping that booklet away. Again, we can always remove it and store it in the combine also. So you can see here I've removed the side panel of the Cutterbar. What this is doing is this is giving me access to the side of my main gearbox for that of my knife drive. So we can see this being a 9-meter Cutterbar, I can either have the single knife drive as standard or the twin knife drive as an option. However, for that knife drive gearbox, we can then see that sight glass. We can see the oil level in the sight glass. Please do make sure that you also have oil in that sight glass at all times. And also, whilst making sure that we have oil in it, please make sure that the sight glass itself is again on the level so we're getting a true reading from that sight glass too. You can see here it's notched position for the sight glass to be in. We need to make sure that it's in that level position. Also located above that of the main gearbox, we can see our spare knife section for the Cutterbar too. So again, as a class product, all available with a spare knife section at all times. If we do potentially take a little bit of damage on the likes of our main knife system, and we don't want to have to replace the likes of all of our knives and all of our finger sections, we can remove this spare knife section as a whole. The whole section itself is complete. We can take the old section off and slide the new section on. And this is where on the CONVIO Cutterbars it is located. It is fixed in place with a supporting bracket. All I have to do is remove that supporting bracket and slide the whole knife section out as a whole. So when we're looking at the side of the CONVIO in terms of maintenance, we do have a few adjustments we need to keep our eye on. Our black linkage system here is for the tensioning of our CONVIO belts. Again, the CONVIO belts being an important part of the design of the CONVIO itself. The CONVIO has 3 separate belts. We have one on either side which feeds to the center, and then we have a smaller center belt as well. each of these belts have their own relative tensioner. Now, tensioning of the belts themselves is very important, so that the belts themselves are obviously tight at all times. They haven't got any slack, and they won't be prone to slipping as much too. To make sure we've got the correct tension for the belts is very easy and simple. We can see here our guide in terms of belt tension. Effectively, if our little arrow pointer is in either the red or the orange, that means our belt requires tensioning. If the arrow pointer on our little diagram is in the green, it means that our belt is tensioned and we don't have to adjust it. To adjust the belt tension, all we have to do is adjust the side linkage by clicking in the safety clip and pulling the handle up and out of the way. We can then see the spring tension system behind with that turnbuckle adjustment. All I need to do is turn the turnbuckle either clockwise or anti-clockwise according to the tension required. So we can see by adjusting this rear turnbuckle either clockwise or anti-clockwise, then we're either tightening or loosening that of the belt tension. So then if I tighten the belt tension and then relock the locking handle back into position, we can now see that my tensioning guide has now moved back into the green area, and this now means that my belt is tensioned correctly. When we're doing any work on the Cutterbar itself, we always need to make sure that we're being safe. So on the reel, if we're doing any work to the reel or underneath the reel, we need to make sure that we have our ram stops in position. To put these into position, all we have to do is release the little silver clip underneath and push the ram stop into position. There'll be one on the far side of the Cutterbar, one on this side of the Cutterbar, and if we have a split reel design, we'll also have a center ram stop as well. For the Cutterbar itself, we need to make sure that if we're doing any work underneath, when we have the Cutterbar up in the air, that we're putting both of our hydraulic ram stops in, which are located underneath the feeder house on the rams themselves. So looking underneath the Cutterbar now, we now have the Cutterbar up in the air, remembering to put our ram stops into position if we're doing any work under the Cutterbar itself. We can see that on the side of the center belt that we've also then got the belt tensioners. We have one on this side and we have one on the opposite side of the center belt too. Now, the tensioning principle is the same as that on the side belts. We need to make sure that our belt is correctly tensioned so that we're not getting any additional slip or possibilities of blockage on the center belt itself. However, the tensioning system is slightly different to that on the side. So we can see from the icon that we have a little washer in position, and this washer is relevant to the sticker on the Cutterbar too. So if the washer is in either the yellow or the red location, then we know that the belt requires tensioning. If the washer is in the green location, then we know we're fine and our belt is correctly tensioned. To tension the belt for the center, all we need to do is pull down the releasing catch and then pull the locking mechanism out of the way. Once out of the way, we can then adjust the tension via the turnbuckle system. So I can either turn it clockwise or anti-clockwise, depending on the tension required. Once I've then got my locator into the correct position, I can then take my locking mechanism and pull it towards the locker. It'll then lock into place with the locking bracket on the bottom, and I can see where my washer is relevant to the green sticker. This is the same method we use on this side of the center belt as we do on the opposite side of the center belt too. So with the Cutterbar up in the air, we also have access to our little maintenance flap for that of the center belt. So I can release this maintenance flap down and out of the way, and that will give me access to the center belt and everything underneath it. To release the maintenance hatch, all I have to do is pull the two pins on either side of the flap. So underneath the main Cutterbar now, we can see we've removed that maintenance panel. We now have access to our main center belt. Again, this is a good place if we need to blow out any material at the end of the day or at the end of the season. And also if we potentially maybe have picked up some bad conditions and we're starting to maybe wrap around the center belt itself, and this is the best place we can get in to clear that debris away. So a nice little place to look at the center belt and also to check the tension physically, just to see how it's reacting. Finally, for the central roller, we also have to check the grease nipples for those central roller bearings. We can see the grease nipple located here. There is one on this side of the roller and one on the opposite side of the roller too. Again, please consult your operator's manual in terms of greasing intervals. However, I would always be checking these greasing points at least every other day. So under the main frame of the CONVIO bar itself, we can also see our plastic skid wear pads. Now, be aware that depending on the CONVIO cutter bar we have, will depend on the plastic skid we have. So on the rigid CONVIO bars, it is a wide skid, and on the CONVIO flex bars, the flexible knife bars, they are narrow skids. So again, be wary if you do need to replace these to make sure that you have the correct skid selected. To replace the skids, it is a pop rivet gun action which then locks the skids into place. So again, over time, if the skids become worn, depending on the ground conditions, and we need to replace them, we can remove the skid itself and then replace them with a new section and pop rivet the points in. Underneath the CONVIO cutter bar, we can also see our auto contour adjustment in the form of sensor bands. Now, one main difference again to note is that compared to the Vario cutter bars that we also offer, the skids or the sensor bands on the CONVIO cutter bar are made of plastic rather than metal. So do be aware that they will be a different part number or a different part selection if you do have to replace them from your spare parts department. Again, the way the auto contour bands are working when the CONVIO bar is in its rigid form is that as the CONVIO cutter bar is moving up and down on the ground, we'll see the sensor bands themselves being pushed forward and backwards. This is what's given us our auto contour adjustment for the cutter bar itself. Again, from a maintenance point of view, it's always worth just double checking your sensor bands to make sure that they're not damaged, or if any chain is broken. If this has happened, you will notice your cutter bar may be reacting a little bit differently than it does in standard conditions. So again, a nice little point to make sure of is to make sure that they are moving and working correctly. Underneath the cutter bar, also see the bottom of our knife sections and our finger sections for crop feeding. So if we were in the field to potentially damage some of these, maybe bend or break one, we can see how we would replace that of our finger sections. So loosening the nut and removing the bolt from on top. Removing both bolts will obviously then allow us to slide that finger section out to be replaced. In terms of the knife sections, we can see that from the bottom they are a turn screwdriver system or a turn bolt nut system. So if we do have to replace these, we would remove the two bottom bolts and then replace the section and replace the nuts and the bolts themselves. From the bottom, we can also see our little bearings which we use for the likes of our crop lifters. These are what our crop lifters are being located into when we're fitting them with that new design. So sections with the crop lifter bearings on will also have that slightly longer bolt section too. Do be aware that the cutter bars with the twin knife drive system, so the larger cutter bars in our offering, will have that center overlap of the knife itself. So the finger sections which are in the center of the knife will have a slightly different part number to that of the normal sections. This is because we need a larger gap in the center of our finger because we have two knives overlapping rather than one. Underneath the cutter bar, we can see the supporting brackets for that of our main bar itself. Now, depending on the cutter bar we have, will depend on the way the supporting brackets work. On a standard CONVIO, like the one you see in front of you here, these are obviously rigid sections which are supporting that of the entirety of the cutter bar, and the auto contour is being controlled by that of the sensor bands. On our CONVIO Flex cutter bars, these sections are adjustable. They're the flexible sections which are giving flex to that of our entirety of our cutter bar itself. They are adjusted by that of hydraulic actuation, so again the whole section itself is moving up and down, which has given us the flex to both our cutter bar knife and the cutter bar itself. So we can see here on our central auger our retractable fingers which are pulling the crop and grabbing it and taking it up through the feeder house. Now, if we were to damage one of our retractable fingers, if we were to break it or shear it, they can be replaced. To do so, all we need to do is access them via the side maintenance hatch, so the hatch which is closest to the finger for you to. we can replace them via the side maintenance hatch. So this is the hatch which would be closest to the finger that you need to replace. There are multiple hatches on the auger itself. To open the hatch, all we need to do is take our Allen key and remove the 2 bolts. We then remove our maintenance panel. Once the maintenance panel has been removed, we will release the quick attach clip, which is inside holding that retractable finger in place. All you have to do is take the clip out of its locator, and then we can slide the whole retractable finger out of its slot. And you can see with our new retractable finger design, they're not a bolted design, again they're a notched design, so all we have to do is take the new retractable finger, push it into its new slot, and then clip the clip over. There's no more bolting on the likes of our Cutterbars in that respect. The retractable fingers are designed to shear at a certain area, so a certain part, so we're not going to cause any damage to the actual locking mechanism. So as I say, to replace them, all we need to do is slide the new retractable finger in, clip the clip back over, and then replace the maintenance panel. So on the front of our CONVIO Cutterbars, when we're blowing down and cleaning them, we need to be aware of a few certain areas. As standard on our CONVIO Cutterbars, we also have this little indent on the front of the bar itself here. This is purely for stone protection and stone catching. So if we were to take in any stones on the Cutterbar itself, the heavy stones would then fall to the bottom of the Cutterbar and be collected in this little Cutterbar cutout here. Again, when we're cleaning down the Cutterbar at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're removing these stones and putting them on the edge of the field. Also, again, in some maybe very heavy or dense crops, maybe green crops or wet crops, we need to make sure that we're not bundling or catching any crop in between the belts themselves. So it's always very important to make sure that after either a long day or a couple of long days, we're blowing down our Cutterbar and making sure we're keeping the gaps in between the belts nice and clear too. As I've also mentioned, we also have belt slip limits on the Cutterbar too. So if our belt slip starts to go off, if our belt starts to slip a little bit on the Cutterbar, then this will send a warning to our CBUS menu, and us as an operator will get this warning and know that our belt is starting to slip. This is a prevention system or a monitoring system for both the side belts and the center belt. So if your slip limit does start to go off, it's always worth checking to make sure we haven't got our belt caught on any debris, or to make sure our belt is correctly tensioned.